Good morning, everyone. Today is day 6 of Make Your Own Sourdough Starter with me. And I don't know how your sourdough starter's doing. I hope it's doing really good. But I wanted to show you how mine's doing. I have a line here. The line is where I fed it last night and where the level of it was. So you can see it's almost doubling now. And it's got some nice bubbles. It's always hard for me to see exactly where to show you this on the camera. Anyway, so it's got some nice bubbles and it's actually starting to smell good this morning. So we're over the hump of the bad smelling starter and it's bubbly and it's starting to smell good. And we're almost halfway through. Tomorrow will be the halfway point. So the starter's doing really good, and so we'll go ahead and feed it this morning. I'll pour out all but about 30 grams of starter, and I'll go ahead and continue feeding it the 60 grams of water and the 60 grams of flour, and because it's doing really good at that, so I'm going to continue to feed it at that ratio. That's a 1 to 2 to 2 ratio, and it's working pretty good for my starter, so I'm going to go ahead and continue. So you can see the little line there. So tonight, if you want to, or this even today, if you feed your starter this morning, go ahead and put a line where the starter is after you fed it, and then watch it throughout the day and see how much it will go up. Mine didn't quite double, but it's doing really good. See if your starter is going to double after maybe 6 to 8 hours, or even 10 hours or 12 hours, because it still may take a while for it to double. So let's go ahead and feed the starter. Pour out half here. Well, no, I'm going to pour out more than half. I'm going to be pouring out all but about 30 grams. Okay. And you can either estimate the 30 grams or you can just get a new container and measure your 30 grams. It's just not that critical, but I'm pouring out most. That's what I'm doing. Especially now that it's good and vigorous. It's going to last longer on more food and water. So let me tear that out. We'll put 60 grams of water. And I have my flour mixture here, which is the half all-purpose and half white wheat berries that I ground when we first started this 6 days ago. There we go. And I'll stir it up. Do it a little bit vigorously so we can incorporate some oxygen in there. Here we go. So I hope your sourdough starter is doing really well today. If it's lagging behind a little bit, that's okay. Don't worry. You can just continue to feed it and check it every day. Remember to not only look at it, but smell it. See what it smells like, especially in the first 4 to 5 days, when the smell of it can change quite a bit from being really awful to where it starts smelling pretty good, like mine is smelling pretty good today. So feed it, keep feeding it twice a day, about every 12 hours, once in the morning and once in the evening. And you should start noticing a vigorous sourdough starter by now. So like I said, you might want to check, put a line on it after you feed it and check and see if it's doubling and how long it takes to double. So there was a few things I wanted to talk about. This morning isn't going to be very long. As a matter of fact, most days are kind of boring when you just have to feed it twice a day. But somebody mentioned about their sourdough starter never smelling bad. And I realized that in some areas you can have water that's pretty acidic. So if in your area you know the water is pretty acidic, then your sourdough starter may not have a problem in the first 4 days of smelling bad. It might just go ahead and select the nicer micro organisms and jumpstart and get going right away, just as if you were using the same as if you were using the juice in the beginning, which is what the juice is for and why some people use juice in the first 4 days. But then the flip side of that is that if you're in an area where your water is really alkaline, or if you actually make your water alkaline, then you might have some trouble getting your sourdough starter going. And if that's an aha moment for you, like, oh, okay, I'm making my water alkaline. Some people have water systems where they deliberately alkalinize their water. And if that's what's going on with you and you keep having trouble with your starter, then you might want to just not use the alkaline water, or acidify it by using some juice. So another question that I was asked was about container size. And I mentioned earlier, in an earlier episode, that my standard sourdough starter, this is I'm keeping the flour in this, but my regular starter, I use a 2-liter or 2-quart Cambro. And for me, it's a perfect size because you can keep a small amount in it. It's got an airtight lid. It's food safe. It's got, markings here for you to see how much you've got in there. So it's graduated, and you can maintain a small amount. Or if you decide to bake a larger amount of bread, you can feed your starter and keep quite a bit of sourdough starter in here. So this is my personal favorite size. However, if you only ever bake 1 loaf of bread, I think a 1-quart size probably would be, or 1-liter size would probably be fine for you. If you have a small bakery or a farmer's market bakery and you bake 6 to 12 or 20 loaves of bread or more, you of course are going to need a larger container. And so basically, to maintain a starter, you can use a really small jar. You don't need anything very large. This is even larger than I need for starting a starter. But once you begin to make enough starter for your formulas, you may want a larger container, because you should leave enough room for it to triple or quadruple. Every once in a while, you'll just get your starter really active, and I've seen the pictures in Perfect Sourdough in our group on Facebook where they estimated a container size and their starter was a little too vigorous, and it crawls up out of the top, pops the top off, and crawls all over the place. So you definitely want a starter that's quite a bit larger than you think you're going to need, just so you have the expansion room, and also so that you have enough room in the container for the gases that are produced by the starter, especially if it's a airtight lid. So I think that those are a couple of the questions that I was asked. Another question I was emailed with was, should I use a hybrid? This is a hybrid starter that I have here. And the reason it's called a hybrid starter is because it's half whole grain and half white. And so that's what I call a hybrid starter. And they wanted to know, should they use the hybrid starter for all of the different types of formulas? And my answer to that would be, it's up to you. If your formula is about whole wheat bread or a whole grain bread, and you don't want to have any white flour in it at all, you might consider taking some of your starter out into a new container and starting to feed it. only whole grains, so it becomes a whole grain starter. Or you could, you could switch to an all white starter. You could keep a couple different types of starter in your refrigerator or at room temperature, whichever you prefer. If you have a white flour formula for making like, San Francisco sourdough bread or another type of white bread, Vienna white loaf, the basic white loaf. And if you use your hybrid starter, well, it will just add a little bit of whole grain and it will kick in some extra flavor and usually a little extra tang, and it should be fine. So you might just want to experiment with that and see how you like it. But generally, any formula can be used almost interchangeably with any formula, with some common sense. So the hybrid starter is fairly easy to use for just about any formula. But then so is the white starter, and if you have a whole wheat starter or a whole rye starter, you can use those interchangeably as well. With rye and the wheat, you're going to be changing the flavor of your bread a little bit. When you're adding more rye, you're going to have a problem with dough that's a little more sticky. So there's some considerations, especially as you add more and more of it. So I'm going to check and see if there's any questions this morning, and then that should do it for today. So I need to look down here and see. Sochek, hello from Minnesota. Hello, Sochek. Jane Rousseau. Mine sounds like it's doing the same as yours, smelling good and doubling within an hour and a half or so. Well, that's pretty quick, actually. Thanks so much for the lessons. You're welcome, Jane. If the starter doubles in an hour and a half, that's pretty quick. Very often the starters that are young will take longer than usual to double, but no matter what it does, it'll be fine. It hasn't actually stabilized yet. It'll stabilize more towards day 12 to 14. Tony, good morning. I actually made it here on time even, and I'm local too, which is kind of sad. So since I don't have a whole wheat flour, can I use rye instead? Tony, if you don't have a whole wheat flour, go ahead and use rye. Rye actually ferments more quickly than most grains, and so you can use rye. Just if you're a beginning sourdough baker, realize that the rye, as it ferments more quickly, might give you a little bit of trouble. You may have to feed it more often. It will be thicker because if you're using whole grain, all rye, it will absorb more of the water. And also, if you start using it in formulas, rye is a little bit more difficult to handle. It can make the dough a little bit slimy or very wet feeling, and a little bit more slack. So if you're a brand new baker, you might not want to use rye. You might not want to start with rye. It's a little bit more difficult to do that. Jane, would it be beneficial to give it a stir or two in between feedings? If you want to give it a stir, in between feedings, that would be fine. It would probably just invigorate it a little. It would bring the microorganisms to new pasture in the starter, and it would incorporate more oxygen. So sure, yeah, you could stir it in between feedings. Cat, when you discard, you just basically eyeball it, but when you add flour and water, you are using a scale. Can you explain, please? I'm building and maintaining a starter, and it's just not that critical. When you pour out some of your starter and then feed it, it's more intuitive than anything. If I wanted to feed my starter this morning and mix dough this afternoon, I wouldn't leave just 30 grams. I would leave half or most of it, or even all of it, and then feed enough for my formula and enough left over. But because I would be mixing within 6 to 8 hours, I would need to make sure I have enough vigorous starter, so I wouldn't discard most of it. If you're just maintaining your starter, or building a starter, you once it actually starts fermenting and it's doing pretty good, you only need a small amount to keep it going. And so you need a ratio of 1 to 2 to 2, or 1 to 3 to 3, or 1 to 4 to 4. You need more food than you need starter, so that your microorganisms that are in your jar can last a lot longer. And so if you're going on vacation and you have to neglect your starter, you may even want to start with 10 grams of starter and put in 200 grams of flour and 200 grams of water, and really give it a lot of food so it can last a long time. So the other thing is when I pour out the starter, I have my starter at 100% hydration. So when I feed it, if I weigh it, it will stay at 100% hydration as long as I feed it the same weight of flour and water. So although I'm changing the ratio and I'm not being exact scientifically about the ratio as far as how much starter's in the jar and how much I'm going to feed it, what I am doing is keeping it at 100% hydration. And I think for most of your formulas, that's the most important thing, and that would be to keep it at 100% hydration. So if you want to be scientific, and if you want to make sure there's exactly 30 grams left, or 50 grams, or 10 grams, then you can do that. But when you're building your starter or just maintaining your starter, you just don't need that level of accuracy. So I hope that that answers your question, that it's keeping the starter at 100% hydration that's more important. Okay, let's see what else is here. I was thinking of using the rye with white as a hybrid to give it a bit more tang flavor. Tony, go ahead and try, especially if you are an experienced baker. Go ahead and try. If you're a new baker, you will, and you want to use rye, just expect a little bit more difficulty, and you may not. It may come natural to you. So if you want to try it, sure, go ahead. Does the amount of rising of the bread depend upon the types of flour? Yes, the amount of rise you get in your bread can definitely depend upon the type of flour. If you use a strong flour, like a bread flour, you'll tend to get more rise in your loaves, especially if you ferment properly and develop the gluten properly. If you use more heritage grains, more rye, more whole grains, the wholemeal in the grains will cut the gluten strands, and so your dough will tend to have less of an oven spring and it will spread more. Also, your hydration can make a difference in your oven spring. How well you develop your gluten can make a difference. How well you've heated your oven and stone will make a difference, because you need to preheat quite thoroughly to get a good oven spring, to get a really good heat transfer from the stone or the Dutch oven into the dough. So preheating also matters. Some of the heritage grains tend to spread more. Like some of them have more gliadine instead of glutenine, and gliadine is the gluten protein that tends to relax and stretch more. So they have a harder time doing a great oven spring. So yes, your flour definitely can impact your oven spring of your bread, and also the lower gluten. All of the lower gluten flours will, not give you as high of an oven spring as a higher gluten flour. Okay. Sarthak, does the amount of rising of the bread depend upon the type of flour? Okay, I answered that. Bob, can you explain why you throw out half and why not just add to what you have? Okay, Bob, I pretty much answered that just a few minutes ago, and that is feeding your starter for baking a formula is different than just maintaining a starter or building a starter. And but the reason that you discard, the main reason you discard, is so that you don't end up having more and more microorganisms eating less and less food. If you don't discard some of your starter, you will have more and more microorganisms, and the flour that you have in your starter will begin to break down, and you will have it gluey and weak, And so if your starter has a large amount of old starter in it and just a little bit of food, you're basically starving your microorganisms, and your starter eventually will get unhealthy, and it'll probably start getting mold, it'll start smelling bad, and it'll probably end up dying. So you basically want to keep a smaller amount of starter and feed it larger amounts of food. And to do that, you need to either use it by baking with it or discarding. Okay. My starter looks like a moose before feedings. I don't know how to pronounce your name, but I think it's Rocio. Rocio? Hi, Rocio. It seems like honey first, and then you get a hint of sourness. I have a whole wheat starter. That sounds great to me. My starter also looked like a mousse. It was all nice and fluffy and bubbly this morning, and it also had a nice smell this morning. So the hints of sourness that you might get, especially after you stir it, are very often from the bottom where some of the more alcoholic liquid might be, especially if it's time for the feeding. Any opinion on no knead recipe versus kneading? Most people that have followed me for years know that I prefer the no knead or the folding or the more gentle way of developing gluten, but I also will use the mixer for some of the different formulas. So it depends upon what type of bread you want. If you're doing a crystal bread, or if you're doing one of the breads where you need to work it a long time and maybe incorporate butter and other things, then and you're going to use a mixer and develop it quite a bit, then I don't see any problem with that. Personally, I really like the low inoculation, hands-off, or do-nothing type doughs. They are just so lovely to me. They get a nice open crumb, and they're hands-off and they're easy. So my personal liking is for the folding, the no knead, or the do nothing type breads. And if you haven't heard of the do nothing type breads, look up do nothing on my channel on YouTube, and you'll find it. And the idea was started by Johann Ferrand, so I want to give him credit for that. Okay, let's see. I never thought that discarding an old starter before new feedings is so important. Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad that we talked about that because it is important. I have a dried starter I bought when I went to Amish country in Ohio. I bought it in 2011. Is it still good to revive? Absolutely. I got a starter many years ago that was dried in 1960 and was already 60 years old. So when I revived it, it revived fine. When you have a dried or desiccated starter and you go to revive it, it can actually go through some similar stages as beginning a new starter, where you can soak it in water and then begin feeding it water and flour. And it can go through stages where it also smells funky or bad, and then it stabilizes. The good thing about a dried or desiccated sourdough is that it's already something that's known. It's a starter that may be 4 hours proofing, 6 hours, 8 hours, whatever, and it's already got its characteristics. It's already a proven starter. Somebody already liked it enough to dry it out. So it can take 10 to 14 days to revive and become stable. So it takes just about as long as a new starter, but you have a known quantity. You know that it's going to be a good starter. So yeah, go ahead and revive it. It should be awesome. It should be fun to revive an old starter. See what you get. Okay, I don't see any more questions. So this is day 6. We look forward to day 7 tomorrow to see how our sourdough starters are doing. And like I said, go ahead and put a line on your starter and see how long it takes to double. And if you want to, post a picture of your starter with the line and where it's doubling. on Perfect Sourdough on Facebook. And so I look forward to seeing your starters, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for joining me, everyone. Bye-bye.